recording. So over to you, Łukasz. Please introduce yourself, and we're very excited to listen to your talk in this CSIG weekly talk series.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. So should I start now? Or?
It's very good. Yes, please proceed. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I'm a researcher at Stanford right now. My background is in mathematics and statistics and computer science. But then after finishing my PhD in computational and mathematical statistics, I was thinking about doing something more applied, and I moved more into medical data and biostatistics. And now I've joined a laboratory at Stanford where they work with biomechanics. So Scott Delp is the professor working on the biomechanics side, and then on the statistics side, I work with Trevor Hasty on developing new methods for the biomedical data set. And today I will talk about collection and prediction of human gait kinematics. So just to start and to bring everyone on the same page, let's start with describing the context. So for a few minutes, let's just imagine that we are all medical doctors and you are about to see your first patient in your life. You're orthopedic surgeons, and here's the patient. Let's look here. So the patient is a girl, like 5 years old girl, and you see that she has clear problems with her gait. So she lands on her toes with one leg. She has asymmetric gait. She has abnormally grown bones, and all these are symptoms of a disease called cerebral palsy, which is a neurological disorder happened due to mechanical damage to the brain at or around birth. Children like her, after this neurological disorder causes the muscles, then bones grow abnormally, and by the age of 20, many children who are affected by this disease end up in a wheelchair. So ideally, we would like to help them as early as possible. And now, usually what happens in the medical setting is that you will follow the workflow as scientists do as well. So you normally collect the data, then you try to model the data using your knowledge from school or knowledge on other patients who visit the clinic, and then you try to make some predictions and to understand how certain treatments will affect walking abilities of the child. And today I will show you during this short webinar how we can dramatically improve every single part of this workflow using modern deep learning and machine learning techniques in a completely qualitatively different manner. So there were technologies developed for decades, but now with computational techniques from deep learning, we can do much more, as you will see in a second. So let's start with data collection. So what will normally happen to the child, like the one that you've seen before on the video, is that the doctor will send her to a so-called gait laboratory where they will collect signals, or where they will collect information on her movement, very precise quantitative measurements. So they will put those small little balls on her lower limbs, as you can see here, and then they will ask her to walk across the room again, but now in a room filled with those high frequency cameras that you can see on the wall. And those cameras will collect signals of this kind. So the trajectories of those points that are placed on her legs. And from these points, from this cloud of points, we can already read how her joints bend over time. Because what we are interested in are not those balls, because this is just all data. We're interested in something more functional and meaningful, which are joint angles. And we're interested in 4 joints: pelvis, hip, knee, and ankle. We look on the 3 different planes. And if you look over time, during the so-called gait cycle, so one step, those joint angles derived from motion capture data that I've just showed you look more or less like this. So these are curves corresponding to how the joint angle changes in time. Now, interestingly, in the medical practice, doctors can take decisions directly from these curves. So For example, if the knee flexion extension is the range of motion there is small, so the angle goes doesn't move that much, it means that they walk in so-called crouch, so they have their knees bent, and over time it gets more and more bent, and then as I was mentioning, they end up in a wheelchair. So one treatment for that is to lengthen muscles, and the knee flexion extension gets less squeezed, and they can walk more normally after treatment. So, but the point here is that if we take these curves, and the doctor already can tell us what to do. So ideally, from statistics and machine learning perspective, we would like to model how those curves change with surgeries or with treatments or with over time. Now, this is all great. So this is very quantitative and very accurate way to assess human movement. The problem is that, well, there are multiple problems. So first, the cameras that I've showed you are super expensive. So the system, the motion capture system, can cost around $100,000. So not every clinic can afford it. Another problem is that you need an engineer. So you need a highly qualified personnel for writing the entire pipeline, for running it, for calibrating the machines, and then for validating the data and so on. So there must be a person surveying the entire system. You need a physical therapist for every visit, because they put those small balls on the lower limbs, as I was telling you, and they need to measure the child to fit the musculoskeletal model for the pipeline and so on, as you see on the photo here. So it's another person you need to hire, another qualified person you need to hire. And finally, you ask the children to walk in the hospital, so you're actually measuring signals on how they walk if the doctor asks them to walk. But whenever a doctor asks you to do something, you do it differently than you would in the normal life. That's a well-known fact in medicine. So so there are multiple problems that we cannot easily deal with within this expensive framework. So what we were thinking about is that maybe instead of looking on this motion capture data, wouldn't it be great if we could actually extract information directly from a video? So instead of, so as I was telling you at the beginning, as a doctor, you already see here what are the actual problems with the gait, that she lands on her toes and so on. So maybe there's enough information here to already take a clinical decision, and that's what we are trying to test. And for that, we were using open pose and recent advancements in pose estimation. So it turns out that we can very accurately estimate positions of joints and positions of body landmarks in 2D. So these are not 3D signals as from motion capture, but they're still very good signals. And maybe with 2 cameras we can get more and so on. So there is hopefully already meaningful information from videos that we can already extract, unlike previously with not deep learning like methods. So we are trying this. So we're taking the signals, and we are trying to see to what extent we can use them for estimating clinical parameters. So my presentation died for some reason. Just turn it on again. So the point is, as I was mentioning, that we are extracting those 2D positions of joints, so they form a 2-dimensional time series for every single joint. And now, ideally, we would like to transform this data into something that is meaningful for doctors. That's our big hope in this project. So let me get back to the right slide. So the signals look more or less like this. So they are more noisy than the ones that we get from motion capture, but there is some information. So for example, you see directly the period of the time series, and maybe this corresponds to cadence, and cadence is one of the parameters of interest in this case. So it turns out that if we just run the and look at the period peak, we can estimate cadence with fairly good correlation. So we had 0.6 correlation just by using a very naive estimator for the cadence of the patient. So it's already promising. The same with step length. If we look on the distance between ankles and normalize it in the right way, we get 0.4 correlation with the true step length, which is another clinical variable of interest. And finally, if we take all the heuristics that we are interested in, or that could be useful for prediction, and we put it into some machine learning method like a random forest, then we can predict even more complex parameters like GDI, which is a holistic measure of how well the child walks, with very high correlation of 0.82. And most likely from our experience, it seems that we can go even further with that. So like with simple methods, we get actually 0.82. So there's a big promise on using these methods in clinical practice right now. So once they are deployed, we can measure children at scale. We can do some epidemiological studies on cerebral palsy and other diseases, or we can track diseases after a surgery, which is not possible now because a visit in the hospital costs around $500. So we reduce the cost of the visit from $500 to zero, and there are a lot of positive consequences of that. So the objective of this project is to build a library for doctors and for researchers in biomechanics to use very simple signals like videos for assessing complex variables like this GDI that I showed you. Now this was the data collection part. Now, once we have data collected, the other thing of interest is how we can actually infer something and how can we borrow information from other patients to understand our patient. And here we started another project. This is more on the statistical side, as with Professor Hasty, as I was mentioning, and we're trying to develop methods, general methods for hospitals to track diseases over time where patients come into clinic only a few times in their life. So here we will focus on movement, but that generalizes to other diseases as well. So let's look still on this knee flexion extension curve. We would like to assess how this knee flexion extension curve changes over time or changes after treatment. So the data is basically this curve sampled at certain frequencies. So here we have 51 sampling points. And the natural way to treat this data is to run principal component analysis, which basically reduces the dimension. So we take the curves in the population, and we subtract the mean from every curve. We get example curves here on the left. And then when we run principal component analysis, we'll get the 3 principal component scores, like on the right here, or more principal component scores. And then we want to explain it with age of the patient. So we will be modeling how the, for example, first principal component on this knee flexion extension curve changes over time with age. Here we see that for the first principal component, there's not much dependence over time, over age. But with the second principal component, we already see some dependence. With the third principal component, we again see that the component converges towards zero or even below zero with age. So there is already some information on population trends with age. If we now plot it back, so if we go back with this predicted principal components to the original space of curves, we can see how this knee flexion extension changes over time. So here in the gray area on the right, we have a normal population, while the blue curve corresponds to our population, our unhealthy, like our cerebral palsy population, and it changes with age. So the real time right now is mapped to age. So we can see that the curve is getting squeezed and squeezed over time. And that's something that I was mentioning at the beginning, that those children walk more in crowd and they have more and more troubles with bending their knees. So this is a known insight. What we are trying to do now, and what we are actually succeeding to do now, is not to look on the population trend, so but on the individual trend. So up till now, I showed you how we can model the black curve here. So the function of so first principal component as a function of age in the population, where all the observations of patients are treated independently. But we have actually patients coming to the clinic multiple times. So now, if we have the orange patient here on the top, maybe after 2 visits, we will be able to predict that the patient will still have high first principle component after the 2nd visit, and maybe we should do something about that, while other patients come back to the normal. So we are trying to leverage this information. So I will not go into details with this project because it's very technical, but I will be putting the paper on arXiv soon on how we are actually modeling with matrix factorization techniques. So just follow me on Twitter or somewhere, and we'll publish the arXiv version of our new method here. But now, how does it relate to gate analysis back? So I was telling you that we can track those first, second principal component over time. But the great thing about principal components of kinematics of those movement curves is that we can go back to the original space. And that means that if we will be able to predict that the patient goes from negative first principal component to positive first principal component, for example, and then we can go back to the original space and visualize what that actually means and talk to the doctor and talk to the child. So what I'm presenting here is actually the principal component plane. As you are maybe used to see principal components as the cloud of points and 2 dimensions through them. Here we can actually go back really to the original space and see on the left we have small first principal component, on the right we have high first principal component, at the bottom we have small second principal component, and at the top we have high second principal component. And now if I see from my model that the first principal component goes up, and then it corresponds to this rotation in the knees that is visible between the left and right side of the plot panel, because then we would, the larger first principal component, the patient just goes more and more towards right on this panel. And then we can talk with doctors, we can talk with parents about potential risks and benefits of a surgery and things like this. And this is just a side view. So this is enabled by just very simple biomechanical simulations. But now, so I work in a lab where simulation software was deployed, and we're thinking if this simulation software can be used to actually predict surgical outcomes. Because the big problem in biomechanics and in orthopedics is that once you have a child and you want to help the child as much as you can, and you want to sometimes perform surgeries, it's hard to predict how certain surgeries will work. It's hard to design new surgeries because parents normally don't agree on making experiments on their children. That's good, but that's for research, it's suboptimal. So you cannot really test new treatments. You cannot test the treatment on a patient. But what if we could do that in a simulated environment? So what if we have a child like this, and we fit a musculoskeletal model to the child? So we measure bones and muscles. We fit a model. We make the simulated model walk like the child, and then in the model in the computer we just simulate a surgery. So we rotate a bone, for example, or lengthen a muscle, rerun the simulation, and we just see how the child performs, how the child walks after the surgery. This would be ideal. So we wouldn't need to clone patients, we would just simulate patients, and we would learn how the treatment affects the children. So there are a few problems with it. So we do have a good musculoskeletal model, as the one that I showed you on a few slides before, but there are problems with synthesizing movement, because first, it's not obvious how the person controls the body. So we have some insights on which muscles get activated and so on, but to fully synthesize body is quite difficult. And then the bigger problem is even that we not only need to synthesize movement as the child does right now, we also want to synthesize movement after the surgery. So we need to approximate how the brain adapts to the new environment. So the big results come from OpenAI on movement synthesis, but that looks more or less like this, which is if I told you that your surgery will be based on a model like this, you would probably run away from the hospital like the model is running here. So that's great what OpenAI did, but that's not necessarily clinically relevant. So what they did here was that they modeled movement without using experimental data. So they just have a model, they ran deep learning, and they managed to generate movement. But what if we use more accurate system than they did? So we try to use OpenSim software that we developed in the lab, which basically does exactly what their system does. It's constrained with biomechanics. So that's the main difference. So what is here is that we just model current state of the patient as S. The OpenSim model, which is this muscle-driven model, is M. And this model gives us the next state given the active excitations of the muscles. What we'll be trying to do is to model walking. And by walking, I mean just going from A to B as quickly as possible. For now, just for very simple tests of these methods in our environment. So we want to optimize this function. We want to optimize activations to generate movement. But actually, we can do it a little bit simpler. We can assume some Markovian property on we can say that if my leg the movement is periodic, so it shouldn't depend on time. We should have a policy that just takes the current state of my body to take decision on how I behave in a situation rather than current time. And that simplifies the model a little bit because we can model the brain as this function p theta of the state, and we just parameterize theta. And that's what we tried. So like the last few slides of my presentation are about how we applied methods from OpenAI and DeepMind and deep reinforcement learning in this context and what we actually got. So I built an environment that can be very easily run and we can very easily get simulations with 4 lines of shellcode and 5 lines of Python. You can get simulations of more or less like this. So here is already trained for actually not moving. So here's a model that tries not to move the center of mass, and this was fairly easy to train. It just blinks the muscles, but so it's the red muscles are the activated muscles, blue muscles are they're blinking. So because like we have no constraints on energy use, if we add a constraint on energy use, we want to minimize the energy used, then it looks more stable. That's great. But then if we want to move from the stable state to walking, things get more difficult. So it turns out that it's not that easy to actually train this model. So I've been trying to, so here's a short description. Basically the state is the current state of the body, and we want to activate 18 muscles in order to walk as far as possible. And when I tried, I was getting something like this after a week, more or less, which is suboptimal for walking. Here's 2 weeks of training, and I got around 2 steps. And at this point, I realized that, okay, like if I go 1 step more every week, it will take me to reach infinite number of steps. It will take me infinite number of weeks. So maybe let's try something smarter. And we thought, okay, let's try to use the crowd for solving this problem. So we posted we stated the
Yes, I think we maybe have lost Lucas. Let's see if he notices. Okay. Yep, we lost Lucas. Let's see if he comes back.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, we lost you briefly.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Sorry about that. So I'm back, and it's 2 more minutes. I just
okay. Yep.
My computer crashed.
And there's also a little question for you in the chat, which is how do you compare these analyses methods to biomechanics and predictive sabermetrics?
So that's actually something I will be showing. So that's indeed
okay, good.
An important point on. So right now, up to this point, it's actually what we're getting is not yet, still doesn't look clinically relevant.
We don't see your screen yet. We just see you.
That's great that you mentioned. So I'm okay. Now it should be good. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Perfect. Okay. So let me just try last time to go to the presentation mode. Okay, perfect. So so what we did was we ran the challenge around the problems. The idea was that since it takes a long time to actually train these models, let's just try to make people contribute to that and solve my problem. And their benefit is to learn how things work. So we designed the challenge. We put it on the Crowd AI platform, which is a platform at EFL for running challenges, a little bit like Kaggle, but more driven by scientific community. And the challenge was a great success. So we got around 400 people participating, and many of them actually managed to solve our problem. And NVIDIA and IBM and other companies got involved in the running of the challenge, and now we'll be starting even a larger challenge. Let me show you just a few examples of what we got there. So here is solution number 45. So these were the first solutions that the participants were sending. It seems that there is some physiology already involved, but it's still not optimal. Here's another solution. As you can see, they had a lot of fun with that. So this was important for the challenge, that they actually could see some interesting results. But this is still biologically invisible. So here the agent is trying to avoid balls very precisely. So the balls there are for making the models more robust, basically. So they are randomly placed obstacles on the ground that they need to go through. Here is another solution that is trying to avoid balls very precisely. It's getting closer and closer to some kind of gate. But then this is the main reference to what we are doing. Everybody's saying that it's basically human level performance as long as you choose the human accurately. That's one of the references. Now, the last three solutions that I want to show you, that's already top 10. It's already moving fairly fast, actually, but still not that great. This is a super quick solution. It's just very energy inefficient, but if you try it at home, you will realize that this is actually quite fast. It's just you will get tired very quickly. And still, like to this point, biomechanics experts that I've been working with were still quite suspicious about the value of these methods, that they were not sure if actually we can do something relevant. But it turns out that yes, so the winning solutions and top solutions look more or less like this. And this is already compared to this OpenAI skeleton that was running like crazy. This looks already very reasonable. And now the natural question is actually how reasonable it really is compared to experimental data. So we collected data on runners running at similar speed. And on the left, you can see the comparison of the true runners in gray with our virtual model shown as black lines, black curves here. So when we compare kinematics in hip, in knee, and in ankle, we see that we are somewhere around 2 standard deviations from the normal run. So that's not yet perfect, but it shows that without any experimental data, we're getting actually close to something clinically relevant. So now, if we fit the model and we teach it to learn from scratch, now if we attach, for example, a prosthetic leg to the model, we would be able to predict how the person will run with a prosthetic leg. That's the big assumption. So since this was the very successful project, we're actually continuing this year, and we are trying to do exactly that. We're trying to ask people to predict how amputee will walk with a prosthetic leg. They can use experimental data on normal patients, and they are supposed to predict post-treatment kinematics. That's the big idea. So That will be it. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm very happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Lucas. Sorry we went over a little bit, but any questions, anybody? You can type them in the chat. It was a great presentation, and with a reference to John Cleese as well.
Right.
Any questions, anyone? I don't see any questions. I don't hear any. Well, then please thank the speaker. Oh, any links if someone would like to take part. So that's somebody likes to join your project. How can they participate?
Right. So let me send you the link about the project.
Yeah. Please thank our speaker in the chat. If you like the session, please do say thank you to Lucas.
So just commenting maybe on this taking part. So it's really, again, we'll run it as a challenge. So there are two things. Like we run it as a research project in the lab, but also we run a challenge to stimulate the use of reinforcement learning for medical use rather than gaming and so on. So the challenge is an official NIPS challenge. NIPS is the main artificial intelligence and machine learning conference. And so I really, we really accept any contributions on, well, basically you can participate in the challenge, you can win prizes, and you can learn reinforcement learning. Or if you're an expert in reinforcement learning, you can work on projects that are really clinically relevant, since we are working with clinicians on making this as close as possible to clinical use.
Thank you, Lucas.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time as well, and for the invitation.
Yeah, and good luck with, I hope some people from this call join your project.
Yeah. Great, okay.
Okay, yeah, people are thanking you in the chat now.
Perfect, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't have a call scheduled for next Thursday, but I do have calls scheduled for the few Thursdays after that. If anyone has suggestions for next Thursday, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll send out some publicity if we do go ahead next Thursday. Yeah, thank you, everybody.
So are you actually posting that on the website as well?
Yes. Yes. I'll send you an email with where we post it. But we essentially post it on the CSIG website. Let me put the link in the chat. You'll see everybody else's recordings there too. And also, I usually post the presentation ahead of the call, but I didn't this time because the PDF was a little weird that you sent. So if you could do a PDF that's, so here I've posted in the chat where the recording goes. And just so you to go take a look, you can see everybody else's recording in PDF.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, and I do see we do have one of the future speakers, I think, on today. Francois, are you on, Francois? Maybe you are. So he's going to present, I think, in a couple of weeks' time on TensorBoard. Yeah, but anyway, thank you, everyone, and I'll post this recording soon on that site, and if I get a PDF from you, Lucas, that'd be great.
Perfect. Sure. Yeah, sounds great. Thank you as well.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.